Hall in Burlington. Welcome to the OSHIR at Dartmouth Summer Lecture Series. A few housekeeping items. First, turn off your cell phones or silence them. Even if you think you have, please check them. We do not want phone call during the session. Thank you. Our format this year is the same as last year, so we'll have the speaker will talk for about an hour. We will have a 30-minute break for coffee and cookies. Unfortunately, we won't be out on the veranda. We'll be down the hall. There's plenty of room, we think. And then we come back for about an hour, question and answer, again, the same as last year, which is the third comment is write your questions down on that 3x5 card you were given or any piece of paper and bring them to the front at the intermission so that we can sort them out and get them ready for the Q&A session. And we're also going to be getting by email questions from our friends up in Burlington. I would now like to take just a second to thank our underwriters who help with the expenses for this program, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Kendall at Hanover, Ledyard Bank, and Wells Fargo Advisors, who I think has been our longest standing supporter of the OSHIR Summer Lecture Series. And the other new feature that we've added this year is that we've teamed up with Hopkins Center Films to bring you 3 documentaries connected to sessions for this series. And the first one of these will be next Tuesday, July 18th, at 7 o'clock right here in Spalding, and it's 0 Days, which is about the cyber attack by the United States and Israel on the Iranian nuclear program. And that precedes next Thursday's session on cyber warfare and security. I'd also like to acknowledge Dan Benjamin. Dan, are you in the audience? If you are, would you please stand up so we can, there he is over there. Dan Benjamin is the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth, and John and I consulted with him over the course of the last several months to get names of good speakers for this series, and he's been invaluable. Thank you, Dan. And he's also a good friend and had suggested today's speaker, Jim Steinberg. So with that, I'd like to introduce my co-chair and partner in crime, John Ferries, who will take it from here. John.
Thank you. It is a privilege and an honor to introduce our distinguished expert and speaker on U.S.-China relations, James Steinberg. After graduating from Harvard and getting a law degree from Yale, he worked as a clerk to a federal judge, an aide to Senator Edward M. Kennedy on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and a senior analyst with the RAND Corporation. He entered the public sector in 1994 when he was appointed U.S. State Department Director of Policy Planning. Then in 1996, he was appointed as Deputy National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton. After serving in the Clinton administration, he joined the Brookings Institution as Director of Foreign Policy Studies. He then became Dean of the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. He was one of the principal authors of Barack Obama's historic address on the Middle East in Cairo in 2008. In 2009, Jim was asked by Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, to become her principal Deputy Secretary of State, and he agreed to do so. While his responsibilities as Deputy Secretary of State covered a global spectrum, he gave particular focus to U.S.-China relations in the turbulent Middle East. In 2011, after 3 years as Deputy Secretary of State, he went back to the private sector, becoming Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. where he now serves as Professor of Social Science, International Affairs, and Law. In 2014, he co-authored with Michael O'Hanlon a book on U.S.-China relations called Strategic Reassurance and Resolve, U.S.-China Relations in the 21st Century. And when it came out, and to this day, is a defining book on a solution of the way forward when you have a dominant power and you have a rising power, and how do you deal with all the strategic issues that arise. He will be signing this book in the back outside the doors during intermission. So if you want a copy, please feel free to go there for that. And finally, on a personal note, Jim's wife, Sherry, is an environmental scientist, and they have 2 daughters, both of whom, fittingly, they adopted from China. Jim often rises before dawn to run several miles before going to work, and he has logged several marathons under his belt. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm welcome to Jim Steinberg.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here today. And thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. As you'll guess, I didn't get my usual run-in this morning, and I appreciate you all coming out in this all too familiar rainy weather we're having this season. But it really is great to see so many people here, and I look forward not just talking at you, but perhaps much more enjoyable for all of us, the question and answer session in the second part of our program. This is obviously a very timely topic that we're discussing today. I think that's what brought so many of you out. But in case you don't have a full appreciation of just why this is timely and important, let me just begin with a short, since this is the 21st century, YouTube video.
Let's say China. China, 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 China. I have to have my China. China, 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 China. I know China very well. China, 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 China. I'm from China, 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 China. I have people that I know in China, 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 China. I'm from China, 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 China. I have people that I know in China, 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 China. I've been saying China, 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 China. I like China. I go to China. China, 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 China. Go to China. China. China, 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 China. You went to China. China, China. Get a job in China. I know China. I love China. China, 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 China all the time. China, 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 China. And by the way, I love China.
That says it all right there. So that's why we're here. We're here to talk about China and U.S.-China relations. And it's certainly been very clear both during the campaign, during the transition, and during the early years of the Trump administration why this is such an important topic and the centrality that the president, and not just the president, but all of us place on this relationship. We've seen over the past several months the priority that the administration has put on it. The president just had his second meeting with the president of China, Xi Jinping, as part of the G20 meeting 2 weeks ago. Issues ranging from North Korea to the South China Sea, to trade, to climate change, to issues of cybersecurity, and even human rights, as we see now with the controversy over the treatment of the Nobel Prize winner Liu Xiaobo in China, all figure prominently in the day-to-day of U.S.-China relations. And we've seen, even in the short period of time that the president has been in office, sometimes seems more than a short period of time, a lot of gyrations in terms of the overall approach, from the campaign rhetoric that you just saw to some suggestions during the transition that the president might rethink the U.S. One China policy, to the very warm meeting that the two leaders had at Mar-a-Lago, to the more recent sense perhaps of a little bit of disillusionment or disappointment in the way China has handled issues ranging from North Korea to the South China Sea. We have a sense of, on the one hand, a great deal of priority the administration is putting on U.S.-China relations, but also a certain degree of uncertainty about what direction this will pursue. But it's not just the president that's focusing on China. If you just head to your local bookstore and you look at the books that are for sale today, you see these headline attention-grabbing titles from authors like Professor Graham Allison or Ian Baruma or Professor Amitai Etzioni for GW, with a diversity of views about the nature of China's evolution and the direction of U.S.-China policy, but a growing chorus of observers, of scholars and pundits who see a clash with China between the United States and China as either inevitable or at least highly likely. Just examine the titles. Graham's book called Destined for War, or Michael Pillsbury's book, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America. Now, those aren't the only voices, although we hear them perhaps more often because they raise such great alarms. There are others who have a much more benign view. Donald Gross, for example, wrote a book recently called How the U.S. Can Benefit from China's Rise. My own view, and that's what I'll be talking about this morning, is squarely in the middle of these different, perhaps extreme views about where U.S.-China relations are today and where they're going. In a monograph that my colleague Mike Hanlon and I just published last month, we titled our book A Glass Half Full. And I think you can see that it really represents a range of potential views about where we are. The one thing everybody agrees on is that the relationship is enormously consequential. It's widely acknowledged by politicians and scholars alike as the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world today. We are the world's two largest economies, the two largest militaries. We are the first and third most populous countries in the world. We are the two countries at the leading edge of technology in so many different fields. And we have long traditions of proud culture and our sense of an international role, all of which means that this is a truly consequential bilateral relationship. And as you all know, and clearly that's what brings you here, it's a relationship that has multiple dimensions, both areas of significant cooperation, but also areas of tension. There are areas where we cooperate together, so-called plus-sum, win-win type opportunities where both countries benefit in dealing with global challenges like terrorism, global public health, or at least until recently, climate change. And other areas where there are tensions and more of a zero-sum, a win-lose quality to the relationship. So the task we've set ourselves for this morning is how to think about these conflicting views about the nature of the U.S.-China relationship, its direction, and perhaps more important as citizens, what should we do about this? What policies might each side pursue, China and the United States, to maximize the potential for cooperation, to try to manage the differences where they inevitably will exist, and to minimize the risk of confrontation, which would have calamitous consequences, not just for our two countries, but for East Asia and the world. Now, that's a pretty big topic. We've got a fair amount of time, but it seems like a lot to cover in an hour. And I was a little bit pessimistic about this until 2 nights ago. I turned on the TV with my family, and we turned on PBS, and there was a program called The Story of China, which purported to tell you the entire history of China in 2 hours. So if PBS can do the entire history of China in 2 hours, I can cover U.S.-China relations in a little less than 1. In talking to you today, I'm going to bring the perspective both of a scholar and a practitioner. I've had 25 years of experience in dealing with China as a government official beginning with my first trips there in 1993 and 1994 in the Clinton administration, and through two presidencies, through President Clinton and President Obama, as well as several decades of teaching and writing about China and East Asia. From those early years, indeed, even before my first visit, and advising President Clinton during his campaign in 1992 and the transition of his taking office, through such consequential events as the Taiwan Straits Missile Crisis in 1995-96, Jiang Zemin's historic visit to the United States in 1996-97, and then President Clinton's 10-day visit back to China in 1998, the negotiations that ultimately brought China into the World Trade Organization, to the shaping of President Obama's East Asia policy during the campaign and the development of the so-called rebalance or pivot. I've had a chance to be involved with senior policymakers in both countries, looking at the evolution of this relationship during a period of remarkable change in China, as you'll all recognize, but also important changes here in the United States as well. Now, most of us have seen a dramatic evolution in our lifetimes in the nature of the U.S.-China relationship. I won't begin to try to guess the age spectrum of all of us here, but for many of us, and I would suspect for at least a significant number of you here, most of the initial framing of the relationship came from the Cold War period, a period of time beginning with the triumph of the communists in 1949, in which the United States had a deeply confrontational and a strange relationship with China, with no diplomatic relations, with a quasi-war during the Korean War, and a period in which we were seen largely as enemies. For those somewhat younger, they missed that period, and it's defined by the dramatic opening of U.S.-China relations with first Henry Kissinger and then President Nixon's historic visit to China. And then finally, for those even younger who see this now from a post-Cold War perspective, a rising China and perhaps a sense of growing tension and rivalry in the relationship. These are very different frames. Each of us brings our own historic experience to it. My own, like so many of you, is often shaped by sort of personal experiences. When I was growing up, not too far from here in Brockton, Massachusetts, southeastern Massachusetts, some of you will know Brockton, a famous shoe city. It's long since stopped being that, but when I was young, it still was an important place where people manufactured shoes. And one of my neighbors, Bob Green, had been in the shoe business, and in 1968, he had an idea, which was that the future of manufacturing was not going to be in the United States. It wasn't even going to be in Italy for shoes. It was going to be in China. And he made a visit really during the height of the Cold War, at a time when it was very difficult for Americans to go to China, to engage with China, and there's certainly a lot of suspicion in China. This was during the days of the Cultural Revolution, to have much interaction. But he went to Guangdong province and began to talk to some of the local leaders there, and began to have a vision of a possibility of a new kind of relationship and a new kind of engagement. He was just a businessman, but it was a visionary sense of the potential there. And when he came back with pictures and stories about engaging with a very, very poor, very backward China, and yet one in which he could see the vision. And that was my first exposure. Followed subsequently a couple of years later by two colleagues of mine, two students, whose parents had been involved in a group called U.S. China Friendship. I don't know if any of you ever heard of this, but back during the Cold War days, there were a very small number of Americans who thought our policy was wrong, who thought we should have more of a positive relationship with China. They were pretty ostracized during the Cold War, thought of as kind of red or left-leaning. But my friends, their parents had been very involved in this, and after the Nixon opening in 1973, they were among the first Americans invited to come and teach in China. They went to Anhui province, the capital city there, and the capital city Hefei, and spent 2 years teaching there. And the stories and the letters they wrote back were, for me, a first glimpse, a personal glimpse, into a China that was just beginning to emerge from the Mao era, the early days of Deng Xiaoping, the early days of reform and opening up. And those, for me, were intriguing windows into a world of which we knew little. There were very few Chinese who came to the United States in those days, very few Americans who came there. And we've seen over the years this deepening relationship, this growing sense of awareness and understanding of each other. But yet, despite that all, also lots of areas where understanding is still very thin and very missing. And so, as we've seen this incredibly intense relationship develop on an economic, political, security relationship, we still have to deal with how do we understand China, both understand the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people. And I want to tell a couple of stories to begin with about my own diplomatic engagement with China to set the frame for this more, perhaps theoretical discussion we can have about how to think about the relationship. As I said, I began my government experience in dealing with China during the early days of the Clinton administration. And as some of you will recall, when President Clinton ran for office, he was very critical of President George H.W. Bush's foreign policy on a number of respects. But one of the highlights was his argument that the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, had been too cooperative, too forgiving of China for the suppression of the democracy movement at Tiananmen Square. Indeed, President Clinton used very colorful language, candidate Clinton, talking about the butchers of Beijing and about coddling the leaders there, and vowed to pursue a policy as president that put much more emphasis on human rights and democracy as part of the U.S. China policy. And in particular, he vowed as candidate that he would link our continued trade relationship with China, our what was then called most favored nation trading relations, to improvements in China's human rights record. And as we came into office, I came to work at the State Department for Secretary Warren Christopher, and the president said, okay, here's your charge. I said during the campaign, no MFN if there's not an improvement in China's human rights records. That's your job, is to go make that happen. Secretary Christopher, a great American, great public servant, great lawyer, took this as his responsibility, got in a plane, headed off to Beijing with a list of things that we expected China to do to improve its human rights record, to deal with the labor camps, to deal with forced sterilizations, to deal with many of the issues that are familiar to you in terms of the human rights record in China. And we put this down, and Secretary Christopher had a long experience. He'd been deputy secretary in the Carter administration, so he's not somebody who had never dealt with diplomacy, but there was somehow the sense that we would put these things down, the Chinese would agree, and all would be well. Well, surprise, surprise. We got to Beijing, and the Chinese said, excuse me, and no thanks. And if you want to cut off trade relations, that's your problem, not ours. It was a very sobering moment because, after all, we were the world's superpower. The Cold War was over, and we were an important market for China. So surely they were going to at least engage in a give and take or a negotiation. No give and take, no negotiation. Your problem, not ours. As the Chinese like to say, they always have a proverb for everything. It's remarkable. I think they must have a kind of special course that they teach in proverbs for all occasions. But the one that I've heard most over my career, which I was exposed to for the first time on this trip, was, he who tied the knot must untie it. Maybe it was your problem that you made this commitment to link MFN to human rights. Now, if it's a problem for you, you go fix it. We're not going to fix it for you. We came back. We reported back to President Clinton. And the president faced a very consequential choice, which was he'd made this campaign commitment. He was very visible about this. There was a lot of support in Congress for doing something, a lot of continued anger about Tiananmen Square. Christopher came back and he said, Mr. President, in my judgment, they're not going to move. And President Clinton reflected on it, and he came to the conclusion that despite the campaign promise, that realistically, it was unlikely that China was going to change these policies. They were very important to the Chinese leadership. They are fundamental to the way the Chinese leadership saw their own system of governance, and that we had to think hard about whether we were going to pull the trigger on that threat. And as some of you will know, we did not. The president concluded that it was not in the U.S. interest to deny China MFN. He invoked a waiver, and we moved forward. That was a very rocky early period. in U.S.-China relations, and it became even rockier a year later when, during the presidential campaign in Taiwan, the Chinese government became alarmed at the possibility, which became the reality, that the Taiwanese candidate from the then ruling party, the KMT, who was pretty focused on certainly autonomy, if not independence for Taiwan, might win in what was really the first democratic election in Taiwan. And again, some of you recall, in an attempt to influence the Taiwanese in this election, the Chinese fired missiles around the Taiwan Strait. And that was designed to show that the Taiwanese voters that there was potentially some risk if they went through with this election. The United States, President Clinton, Secretary Perry, who you'll be hearing from, you can talk to him about this, he played an instrumental role in this period, came to the conclusion that although we did not favor Taiwanese independence, that it would be unacceptable for China in its turn to try to coerce us on something that mattered to us, to coerce either the Taiwanese voters or the Americans and our relationship with Taiwan by this implicit threat of force. And so at the recommendation of Secretary Perry, President Clinton dispatched 2 aircraft carriers to the vicinity of Taiwan. And although the Chinese never acknowledged the linkage, the missile firing stopped. Lee Teng-hui was elected president of Taiwan. And it was a period in which there was then a pivot in the nature of U.S.-China relations. We've gone from this period of, on the one hand, China rejecting our attempt to coerce them on human rights issues, and from China trying to coerce us on our Taiwan policy, to a recognition that the United States and China had to find a different way going forward. Shortly after the missile firings, I became involved in a new crisis in U.S.-China relations because it became clear that Chinese, or at least Chinese companies, were selling technology to Pakistan to support the Pakistani nuclear weapons program. And this was problematic, one, because from the U.S. perspective, this was not a good thing to see nuclear proliferation. But perhaps even more immediately consequential, under U.S. law, the United States, the president was obliged to impose sanctions on China or any other country for helping a non-nuclear state develop nuclear weapons. And so once again, the indefatigable Warren Christopher was sent off to try to talk to the Chinese about this problem. And so in some ways it resembled that first trip in which he was going to try to tell the Chinese to change their human rights policy. But this one came out differently. And in a meeting that took place between Secretary Christopher and then Foreign Minister Chen Shih-chen of China, unlike the first meeting, which ended in acrimony and a standoff, this one ended in agreement. And it ended in an agreement in which the Chinese both agreed to work with us to end the support for the Pakistani nuclear program, but also for the first time for China to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Why was this different? Why did it come out differently than the first episode when Christopher made his visit to try to convince the Chinese to change their human rights policy and their democracy policy? I think the answer is because Christopher was successful in demonstrating to Chen Shih-chen and the Chinese leadership that actually it wasn't in China's interest for Pakistan or other non-nuclear countries to have nuclear weapons programs. And this was not a case where our interests were reverse or opposite, and that our interests were in common. That was one reason why I was successful. But the other reason why I was successful is, unlike the first time, Christopher did not go by threatening the Chinese, but rather came to say, this is a place where we can show the world and show both of our publics that we can work together on common issues. And so even though in the background there were these threats of sanctions, Christopher never raised the issue of sanctions as a way to get the Chinese to go along with the decision to cut off the sale of these ring magnets to Pakistan. And so with this successful agreement, inaugurated a new phase in U.S.-China relations that led, as I said at the beginning, to President Jiang Zemin's visit to the United States and then President Clinton's visit to China for 10 days, 2 years later. So this is, I offer these as a way to sort of begin to think about the nature of the interaction between the United States and China. But I also think it's important to reflect a little bit on the historical context as well, because as the folks probably at Wells Fargo and certainly other financial institutions say, well, past performance is no guarantee of future. Understanding this past relationship really is quite important in terms of the context of understanding the relationship. And it's a very complex history, of which most Americans are fairly unfamiliar. This is not a sudden new discovery with the pivot to Asia under Obama or even the confrontation during the Cold War. It's a relationship that goes back to the very earliest days of the American Republic. A very thoughtful American journalist, John Pomfret, observed in a book he wrote a couple of years ago, and I'm quoting from him now, Americans and Chinese have been enchanting each other and disappointing each other since they first met in 1784, when the first ship landed in Guangzhou with ginseng and silver to trade with tea. It's an enormously underappreciated history, and the fascination that the early Americans, especially the business community, had with the potential of East Asia, and particularly with the potential of China as a source of great economic opportunity for the United States. And for those of you who are interested, I highly recommend a book by my good friend and colleague, Mike Green, just came out, which is a history of American involvement in East Asia. It's called By More Than Providence, Grand Strategy and American Power in Asia since 1783. It's a wonderful survey of the way we've been involved. And it reminds us that we've had a range of different interests with China and with East Asia for a long period of time. Interests that have been economic interests, interests that have been security interests, and equally interests that have involved our values. The early engagement, as I said, very much focused on the economic opportunity, the trade, the visit of the Empress of China to China in 1783, 1784. But it was soon accompanied by the first American missionaries who came largely from this part of the world, from New England, to China, who had a profound impact both on giving ordinary Chinese their first exposure to Americans, but also reporting back and giving Americans their first exposure to China. And there was also a military component as well. You'll all recall, of course, Commodore Perry and the Black Ships in Japan, but the Pacific Squadron of the U.S. Navy was first created in 1821, and a recognition that if the United States was going to be trading in East Asia, it also needed to worry about protecting its ships, protecting its interests there as well. And it was a very important period in terms of defining U.S. relations with China, because although the United States had deep economic interests and deep economic ambitions with China, it had a different approach than the European imperial powers. The United States clearly wanted access to the Chinese markets, but unlike the Europeans, who came and basically established extraterritorial control and imperial policies, most notably the British, as you all know, but the Germans, the French, and the regional powers, the Russians and the Japanese. The United States essentially developed a different approach, which was, rather than trying to wrest power and control away from China, to try to actually support the Chinese government. Now, of course, this was advantageous for the United States as well, because we couldn't compete with the British or the French or the Germans at this stage of our history. So this idea, embodied in John Hay's famous open door note, was self-serving in a way, but it also was seen by many Chinese as a much more sensitive to Chinese sovereignty, much more supportive of Chinese independence than the European powers. Now, the record was not unmixed. During the famous Boxer Rebellion at the end of the 19th century, when Chinese nationalists who resented these foreign incursions began to attack foreigners, the United States joined the Europeans in sending a military force. We sent several thousand Marines to Beijing to protect the American diplomats there. But still, I think that there was a different resonance about the U.S.-China relationship. The very significant figure of early Chinese independence, nationalism, Sun Yat-sen, studied in the United States. He was actually in Denver, Colorado, at the time that the Republic of China was declared, the end of the Qing dynasty. And so there was a sense on both sides that there was potentially a tie with the early democratic movements in China. And yet those were disappointed, and they were disappointed for a number of reasons over the coming decades. A sense in China after World War I that at Versailles, that the United States failed to honor and protect China's nationalism by essentially allowing the German colonies in China to be turned over to the Japanese. The United States' unwillingness to participate in the League of Nations that basically led in many ways to a free hand for Japan in the Manchuria incident and the growing Japanese incursions into China that led up to World War II. And finally, of course, during the story of the Chinese Civil War. It's a complicated story. We can talk about that later in terms of just how the United States saw the Chinese Civil War and the different voices in the United States. But certainly by the time that the Chinese Communist Party won in the Civil War, declared the People's Republic of China, the early memories of these positive interactions had been eclipsed by more recent activities, and two fateful decisions took place. The decision, first, of Mao to proclaim that China had stood up, and that after the century of humiliation, the Chinese people would no longer be subject to outside influences. And equally important from our perspective, the decision, in Mao's words, to lean to one side, to throw in its lot with the Soviet Union, even though there were voices who remember the earlier collaboration between the United States and China to have a better relationship. And so the Cold War set in. It was a period of deep confrontation. It was a period which, on several occasions, potentially could have led to war and even nuclear war between the United States and China. But even during the darkest days, there were a sense on both sides of voices that a different kind of relationship was possible. A disillusionment on the Chinese side with the Soviet Union, a sense on the United States side that this confrontation was unproductive, that we were not going to change the government in Beijing, and that we needed to find a way to engage, not least of which because as China became estranged from the Soviet Union, so the opportunity for us to work with China became greater. And it culminated in the historic visit by Nixon. And that Nixon visit was consequential not just for the drama of sort of the opening of the door, but also by ushering in a kind of a new consensus about the relationship. And the premise of this consensus was summed up in a phrase that every American diplomat and every Chinese diplomat has expressed for decades, which is that the U.S. and China the U.S. seeks a strong and prosperous China, based on the idea that we have a shared stake in the stability and prosperity of East Asia, that we both stand to lose from an unbridled rivalry between us, and that the differences that do exist, although serious, could be managed constructively. And this was a consensus in American foreign policy that lasted really fairly continuously from the Nixon era. During periods of crisis, there were always challenges to this. I mentioned the Tiananmen crisis, the missile firings in the Taiwan Straits, the EP-3 shootdown during the early Bush 43 administration. And there were always critics who challenged whether this was in the interest. But nonetheless, and despite the fact, as I mentioned, that during campaigns like the Clinton-Bush campaign, that during the campaigns we got a lot of criticism of the U.S.-China relationship and panda-hugging and coddling dictators, that once individuals became to office, they kind of recurred to the mean and tried to work together. And this view was not just the U.S. view about the benefit of a constructive relationship with China, but was matched on the Chinese side. A sense that for China's own interest, its own success, was based on a willingness not to challenge the liberal international order in East Asia and beyond. And this was summed up in a very famous expression. As I told you, there are always great Chinese expressions for everything. But one oft-quoted from Deng Xiaoping in the early 1990s in Chinese, Kao Guang Yang Wei, to hide your brightness, to keep a low profile. The idea that China would benefit from not trying to be a dominant player in the international stage, but rather be part of the system to allow China to undergo the reform and opening up to become economically successful by accepting essentially the U.S. leadership and the U.S. global order. And the strategy worked pretty well. It worked well for the United States. It led to a very peaceful and prosperous East Asia for an extended period of time. It worked extraordinarily well for China as the Chinese economic miracle of double-digit economic growth and increasing prosperity spread widely and seemed to be sort of a fairly stable relationship. But things began to change as the new century began during the first decade of the 21st century. And as China became more successful, more capable, more economically powerful, there became an increasing focus, especially in the United States, on the risks posed by China's rise, by China's maritime claims in the South China Sea, by its military modernization, and a sense that this idea that China would accept the U.S. order might now be it's dated, that it just wasn't relevant to a modern China. We began to hear voices in China arguing that it is really time to follow Mao's lead and talk about a China that has stood up. And this sense of confrontation, the sense that it's one or the other, was very much reflected, I think, in what you heard from the campaign rhetoric of President Trump, but not just on the economic issues, which is what he focused on, but also on the military issues. The sort of sense that China no longer accepted the idea of the U.S. military role in East Asia, that China would no longer tolerate the United States and its alliances in East Asia, that the time had come to really revise that understanding. And in the words of Xi Jinping, the Chinese leadership, to seek a new kind of major power relationship between the United States and China. Now, what is that and what might that be? And that, I think, really is the core question that I want to focus on in the last part of my talk. Over the last couple of years, the critics of the constructive engagement between the United States and China have really moved to the forefront. And I think one of the most telling examples of this was an essay written by Robert Blackwell and Ashley Tellis. Bob was Deputy National Security Advisor, a job I held under President Clinton, which he held under President Bush 43, a very distinguished academic and diplomat. And he and Ashley wrote a book for the Council on Foreign Relations about his establishment in an organization, as you could imagine, that had been very much associated with this consensus policy on U.S.-China relations called Revising U.S. Grand Strategy Towards China. And basically what they called for was a policy of containment to China, to basically accept that China is a threat, a rival, and that it's in our interest not to have a strong and prosperous China, as presidents since Nixon more or less had accepted, but actually to recognize that a strong China is a threat to us, and we should have a weak and uncertain China would be more in our interest. And that, of course, is a pretty big change for some organization as establishment as the Council on Foreign Relations to put forward an idea which is such a big break from the past. And so we have to ask ourselves, has the consensus broken down? Do we no longer have a broad mainstream view that the U.S. and China should cooperate, can cooperate, have an interest in each other's success? And now should we change our focus to prepare for a contest of wills between the United States? It's us or them, mano a mano, with kind of a WWF smackdown between the United States and China. The question is, how do we evaluate this? Here are two very different visions about what kind of relationship we should have. And one of the key questions that I think we have to answer is, how do we think about China's own intentions? Is China's goal to replace the United States as the global hegemon, as the Michael Pillsbury book suggests? Was this period of earlier restraint, particularly during the era of Deng Xiaoping, a matter of China just biding time until it's strong enough to challenge the United States, and now that it is, now that it's economically successful, its military is more capable, that it will now begin to assert its will? Or perhaps are China's aims more limited? Are they seeking a bigger role, such as the larger influence over East Asia, but are content to continue to accept the United States as a global leader? This is an idea perhaps could be seen in a speech that Xi Jinping gave in 2014, in which he called for Asian problems to be solved by Asians, but didn't challenge the broader international role. these are hard questions to answer, the questions about intentions. Some people would say that these are kind of built in the bone, that it's the nature of the relationship between established powers and rising powers, that the rising powers will always want to challenge the order, and the conflict is foreordained, and that's why, in Graham Allison's book, they're destined for war. There's nothing anybody can do about it, just that's the nature of the system. Others argue the system is very different, that because of the economic interdependence of China and the United States, we have too much to lose from having a confrontation. And even though we have differences, cooler heads will prevail. We realize that the stakes are too big, and we'll find our way out of these disasters. It's a comforting thought, but as we now mark the 100th anniversary of World War I, we have to remind ourselves that that sense of economic interdependence as a break on conflict also was the dominant view in Europe just before 1914. So as we think about these questions of intentions, do we have to decide, how do we decide what are the Chinese intentions? And this is a very difficult challenge because we can look at events, and I don't know if any of you recall it or remember, but a very famous Japanese movie called Rashomon, in which the same set of events seen by different players have very, very different interpretations, and each of the different actors looking at the same set of facts interpret them in different ways. Let me give you some examples. If you read the headlines today, we read about the Chinese opening a new naval base in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa. What does this mean? Is this a sign that China is now going to be a global naval power challenging the United States? After all, we have a big base in Djibouti, now they're going to have a big base in Djibouti. Is this kind of a zero-sum rivalry, which would lead to this idea that we have to interpret this as a sign of Chinese intentions to global leadership? Or, after all, we had encouraged the Chinese to participate in the anti-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden, and one of the lessons they learned from that is they need to have some support for their ships and their activities there, and they need a base not to challenge the United States or the global order, but to support UN peacekeeping and dealing with the problems of piracy and terrorism. Same facts, two different interpretations. Take the debate about Chinese One Belt, One Road strategy and this engagement in Central Asia, or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that China has operated. Are these ways of China trying to push out U.S. influence and Western influence and supplant it with a Chinese-led economic hegemony? Or is this China rising to a sense that we had when we created the World Bank of having a global interest in seeing economic development in these relatively poor regions of the world? These are all, and we could go on and on. As we look at these different events that people point to and say, well, this is a sign of Chinese hegemonic ambitions, or these are a sign of aggressive intentions, others could say, no, there's perfectly plausible, understandable interpretation of this. Even military modernization, which seems to many to be the real evidence that China is now becoming more of a threat, more of a challenge. One could simply say, well, when the United States was weak, we too built up our militaries, right? Isn't that the natural result of any country if it has more resources to do what it can to protect its own security? So it's this uncertainty about the nature of intentions that lies, in my view, at the heart of developing a sound policy for the United States to deal with China. Part of the uncertainty is in the nature of the Chinese system. After all, their political process is very opaque. What goes on in the walls of Zhongnanhai, the compound where the Chinese leaders live, is not well known to the United States, even to our intelligence community. And so we don't really know what's the conversations, what the debates are like. They don't have the same kinds of leaks that we have coming out of the Situation Room here. But even if we did know the intentions of the current leadership, that wouldn't necessarily tell us what the next generation will do. What Jiang Zemin did didn't tell us what Hu Jintao will do, and what Hu Jintao did doesn't tell us about Xi Jinping, and so on and so forth. So if we're trying to figure out long-range policy, even if we did know what was in the back of Xi Jinping's mind today, what his grand strategy was, it doesn't necessarily bind his future. And even if it did, even if that were a sense, we thought there was kind of this long-term buy-in from generations of Chinese leaders, we also can't know how exogenous events that might take place beyond the control of the Chinese leadership might shape their decisions. A huge economic catastrophe in China, a global public health crisis, all of these things which could largely change and shape intentions And so for me, what's more important than trying to guess what China's intentions are is to embrace this idea that in the end we can't know, and we have to develop a strategy that will work across the full range of possibilities of what China's intentions might be. Now, if you say, well, we can't know, so how do you deal with a situation where you can't know what the intentions are? And some would say, well, there's a pretty rational answer here, which is, hope for the best and prepare for the worst, right? That's kind of sensible, rational. Who could be against that, right? It seems very kind of prudent strategy, usually called hedging. Why not? I mean, this sounds good, and that way we're not being taken for fools, but we're not just assuming the worst. The problem with this strategy, which seems so tempting and has really driven much of the thinking, especially in the military, is that it has a danger of becoming self-fulfilling. Because if you prepare for the worst, you start to do things that look to the other side like you mean the worst. And so if we say, well, we expect to have a constructive relationship with China, but it might turn sour, so we need to develop lots of military capabilities to keep China in check, the Chinese look at that and they say, well, wait a minute, no, this looks like a containment strategy to us, and you're trying to keep us weak and threaten us. And vice versa. The Chinese say, well, we don't want a confrontation with you, but we want to make sure that there is one, that U.S. carriers can't go back into the Taiwan Straits the way they did in 1996, so we're going to develop these capabilities called A2D, area denial capabilities, just so if things go bad, we'll be protected. And we say, oh no, we know what this is all about. You're trying to kick us out of Asia, right? This sense of the hedging, of the preparing for the worst, is seen by each side as a measure of intentions, that Rashomon effect. We can't know how to interpret these things, and we begin to see these in what the international relations theorists call a security spiral or a security dilemma. Each side, although hoping for the best, preparing for the worst, induces fears in the other, which leads them to prepare for even more worst factors, and so on, and therefore the hedge becomes the reality. And that is a very dangerous possibility. That's one, but it's one set of options about how to deal with uncertainty. The other, another option of dealing with uncertainty is simply to say that for better or for worse, we are the two greatest powers, and we're going to have to decide that the future of the international order depends on us working together. And what we really need is a G2, two countries, a condominium that will work together to try to sort out our differences and create a new order. Some ways, I think, when we hear President Xi talk about the need for a new kind of major power relationship, I think there's a little bit of that's what they have in mind. Well, what's wrong with that? Seems like a good way. We're the two most consequential countries. If we can sort things out between us, it should be fine. The problem with that is that a lot of the other countries are not so sure that will take their interest into account as well. If you're Japan or Indonesia or Russia or India, you're not so comfortable with the idea that the United States and China are going to decide these issues for everybody else. And so this idea of a grand bargain, a G2, which is tempting in some quarters, my good friend Amitai Etzioni, as I mentioned before, has more or less proposed that as a strategy. That, too, I think, is an unsatisfactory way to deal with uncertainty. So another option, not the final option, there are many others, but the approach that Michael Hanlon and I have proposed in this book that we've written, will be available to you after the talk, is called Strategic Reassurance and Resolve. And it's based on two premises, two key concepts that international security people have thought about for a long time, which is, on the one hand, as I mentioned, there is this danger that misplaced fears of the other's intentions will cause us to take defensive measures which create this spiral of action, reaction, and increasing tension, increasing sense of confrontation. And the idea of reassurance is to try to find some ways to try to dispel those fears, to try to demonstrate that what we are doing in a particular case is designed not to threaten the other side, but to protect our legitimate interests. An example of this can be seen in the nuclear realm. It was very prominent during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union began to enter into a nuclear arms race, beginning with the development of the Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. There was a recognition that each side was afraid the other would strike the other one first in a preemptive first strike, and so they had to have capabilities to get the other guy before he got us first, and so on, and the spiral went on and on. And each side recognized that one of the ways that made this particularly dangerous is if you had the ability to strike the adversary, the Soviet Union, and you had missile defenses to prevent them from attacking you back, you might see some advantage in striking forward. So this combination of offensive missiles, missile defense, was seen by both sides as running the risk that there would be a preemptive attack. So in the 1960s, both sides recognized that the surest way to make sure that these missiles were seen as defensive, as retaliation, as protection against the strike, but not an offensive strike, was simply to give up the idea of having missile defenses. And so we had the ABM Treaty, which was a measure of reassurance on both sides. In the U.S.-China relationship, we've had something similar. Up till now, we have more or less agreed that beginning from the time that China developed nuclear weapons in 1964, that we would not try to make ourselves invulnerable to Chinese missiles, because if we did, then that might make it tempting for us to strike China knowing that they couldn't strike us back. We've developed an implicit degree of reassurance between our two sides that leads us to both have nuclear weapons and yet not view each other as nuclear weapons threats to each other. This concept is one that can be applied in lots of different contexts, of ways in which each side can take steps to show that what it's doing, China with its military buildup, can do things to show that while it's taking prudent measures for its own defense, isn't trying to threaten Japan, isn't trying to threaten our allies, isn't trying to threaten U.S. forces. And similarly, we can do the same. We can have in our own military buildup a military strategy that's designed to defend ourselves, but not necessarily to be able to decapitate the Chinese leadership in an early stage of war. And I'm happy to talk about that in more detail in the Q&A. But reassurance itself is not the full answer, because there are some real differences. And sometimes, as they say, even paranoids have real enemies. And that we have to recognize that there are some cases where we can't reassure each other because we do have fundamental differences. And there's the second part of our argument, which is that in some cases we don't need to reassure each other. We need to demonstrate resolve. We need to say, here's something that we can't accommodate. And so, for example, when the Chinese say, well, Asia would be a better place if you didn't have your alliances. They're very destabilizing. They're very threatening to us. If you really wanted to show that you had a good intentions towards China, you would abandon your security relationships with South Korea. You wouldn't sell them missiles. You would end your security relationship with Japan. And that would be very reassuring to us. U.S. response back, no, because actually, in our view, this would be more destabilizing, that if our allies felt they were left alone with China, this would be more dangerous. For example, Japan, without the security relationship with the United States, might feel the need to develop its own nuclear weapons to protect itself. And would the world really be better? Would China really be better if the United States gave up its alliances or refused to provide the reassurances that we give Japan in connection with the island dispute in the East China Sea, the Senkaku Islands? So it's this combination of trying to dispel false fears through reassurance, but also underscoring where we are going to be committed, and that China should know, and we should know from the Chinese side, that they aren't going to be moved, that allows us to develop a balance and a recognition of the fact that we don't want to get dragged into a war that nobody wanted, the true tragedy of World War I. And yet we also need to recognize you can also have war if people don't know what your bottom line is, that if the Chinese don't think we'll come to the defense of Japan, will they be tempted to push harder on the East China Sea or the South China Sea? It is that combination of reassurance and resolve that I think is so critical. And we see this today in dealing with the big challenges of East Asia, whether it's North Korea or the maritime disputes in the East China Sea, that we need to find ways. For example, the Chinese are worried that our defensive missiles in South Korea, the so-called THAAD system, might be threatening to them. We think it's essential to defend ourselves and our South Korean allies from this threat from the North Korean missile program. Are there ways to provide both reassurance and resolve? Yes. The answer is one. We can familiarize China with the technical capabilities of THAAD to show that it doesn't actually pose a threat to their missiles, to their legitimate retaliatory capabilities. We can even be prepared to adapt the way the system is deployed to address that. But we also have to be prepared to say we will not give in completely and say we're going to pull them out because you don't like it. Similarly with the East China Sea, we have to recognize that China genuinely has its own view about its territorial claims there, and that we are not going to change their mind about that. But we can insist that China pursue its territorial claims in a peaceful way by not putting new military installations on these reclaimed islands, by not interfering with international shipping in the South China Sea. These are all combinations of reassurance and resolve that can allow us, I think, to navigate the relationship. To do this will require a very intense degree of engagement. It's a back and forth. It's a sense of, here's what troubles me, what can you do to provide some reassurance on this, and what can I do in return to provide reassurance to you? But also, here's our bottom line. Here are things that you're going to have to find a way to work with on our side. So just as we recognize, for example, that for us, the security relationships with Japan and Korea and Australia are fundamental and things that we are not going to abandon, so too we recognize that China is not going to give up its view about the one China policy and its view about the long-term future of Taiwan. It's finding those accommodations and recognizing where the bottom lines are and where the opportunities for reassurance are that are the essence of diplomacy. And I come back in the end to the anecdotes I began with, which is these stories of my early engagement with during the Clinton administration over first the MFN human rights issue and then the ring magnets. A sense of learning from each other how do we find these accommodations? How do we find this modus vivendi? And I'm going to end with a final anecdote from the Obama years. When I came back to office as Deputy Secretary, we were very determined to try to move the U.S.-China relationship forward, to try to find constructive opportunities to work together on issues like climate change and global public health. President Obama saw this as really a great opportunity and saw a great stake for the United States there. And very early on in his presidency, he met with then President Hu Jintao and had an early trip to China in the fall of his first year as president. But it also became clear that the Chinese had a sense that, well, perhaps President Obama is so eager to have this relationship that perhaps, we can kind of push the envelope a little bit here and move forward on some of the things that we want to do. And it was clear as part of this that there were two things that they had in mind that they did not want the Obama administration to do. Many things, but two in particular that had been on their agenda for a long time. One was the Dalai Lama, who, as many of you know, has met with our presidents informally as a spiritual leader, not as a political leader, for the last 30 years. And the Chinese wanted President Obama to end that practice and to not meet with the Dalai Lama. And second, to end U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. Again, a big irritant in the relationship, something that's been very important. So the president went to China. It became clear that these things were very important. And the president came back and he said, well, I want to build a relationship, but we have some bottom lines of our own. We believe in religious freedom. The Dalai Lama is a highly respected individual. We're not recognizing the independence of Tibet. We've been very clear to China about that. But I'm not going to be told by the Chinese that I can't meet with the Dalai Lama. And he did. And similarly, on Taiwan, we've said we accept the one China policy. We don't support Taiwan's independence, but we have a commitment to provide Taiwan with defensive arms so that it can't be coerced by China. And we're going to keep doing that. And so following his trip, within a couple of months, the president met with the Dalai Lama and agreed to a new tranche of defensive arms sales to Taiwan. The Chinese, needless to say, were not happy. And they made some very strong statements. They canceled a number of meetings between high-level U.S. diplomats and the militaries of the two sides and threatened to impose sanctions on any American firms that did business with Taiwan, really trying to up the ante. The president said, well, if that's the way it's going to be, that's the way it's going to be. But he asked me and Jeff Bader, who was the senior official in the White House, to go to Beijing to have a conversation about this. And Jeff had worked with me in the Clinton administration. We'd been together at Brookings. We were old colleagues. We knew the Chinese, our interlocutors, quite well. And we came, and we were there for 3 days, a total of 40 hours of meetings over 3 days. And the bottom line, we said, was, look, we've been through this before. We understand that we are going to have these differences. You have your bottom lines and some things we have on ours. The question is, are we going to allow this to destroy the relationship? We're going to have linkage between all these issues. So if we do something you don't like in one thing, you're going to disrupt the whole relationship. Or if you do something like MFN, like human rights, are we going to disrupt the whole relationship? Our view is no, that we have to recognize we're going to have these differences, that it's not going to be a relationship of flowers and candy, but that we have a bigger stake here in trying to find our ways to work through these things. And after these 40 hours of meetings, we went away, and it was a little unclear kind of what the reaction would be. But a week later, after we came back, the Chinese announced that after deep reflection, they had decided that they were going to have President Hu Jintao come to Washington the next month for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Summit. Bottom line, I think, is a recognition that for both sides, there are going to be deep tensions in this relationship. There are some differences that are really baked in to the nature of this relationship. But it's also true that if each side begins to recognize and look at the perspective of each other, try to find ways to understand both how what we are doing, which are seen in good faith on our side or in good faith on their side, might be seen as threatening by the other side, and try to find ways to work through those things. And similarly, for each side to understand there are some things that we're not going to change. We're not going to change, they're not going to change, and that we're going to have to find ways to work within that framework. I think the possibility of a glass half full in that relationship remains true today. It will take a lot of wisdom on both sides. Domestic politics makes this particularly challenging for reasons that you'll understand on both sides. It is as true that Chinese nationalism drives the calculus of Chinese leaders, even though they don't have democratic elections, as our own sense of patriotism and national pride drives ours. But I think if we keep those bigger precepts in mind and see how big the stakes are here, we have a way of managing this through and making sure that this relationship continues to be one that, on the whole, is one that is glass half full. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you.
If I can just get everyone's attention before you leave. First of all, thank you for coming, and I truly and publicly wanted to apologize, everybody, for the lines today. If you can see the auditorium, we have over 700 people here. Secondly, a lot of people, I wanted to publicly make an announcement about parking. Please, if you do not have one of these books, pick one up. It will save you for the hassle of parking in future weeks. We have Campion Rink, which I highly suggest you park. It's a round shuttle that's going. If you need to leave early, we can get you back to the parking lot. It's free. You don't have to worry about it. So please pick one of these up. And second, I have 3 folks. If you can see me, we said we didn't have your tickets, and we do. Alessandro, Joe Warner, and Barbara and Dennis Stern. Also, it's raining. Surprise. We open up these doors, and you folks, for those that don't know, we have cookies and beverages outside. A couple of things, you can feel free to go outside. We'll open up the doors, but please, if you can grab your beverage and your cookie and then go inside to keep the lines moving, since there is a ton of people here, it would be greatly appreciated. And if anybody has any questions, we have staff out front. We're happy to help, and thank you very much.
We're going to start the Q&A, which is often the most stimulating, at 10:35. So we have about 20 minutes for this intermission. So we'll have here at 10:35.
the practice hall, the cider hall, the little men's room in the back corner over there. Came up in the elevator and our speaker was still sitting at the quick signing table. Bob and Betty were sitting in their usual place. Uniform revised soldiers in lush parks, not working so well in Afghanistan.
Human systems are very complicated. I know, and I was just standing out there waiting
Welcome back. Just a couple of announcements before we start the question and answer period. Lisa King asked me to mention that for the next 2 weeks, the parking garage will be closed while they're doing repairs there. Sorry. The other thing I omitted to say when I was up here before was that for the documentary films, for those of you with series tickets, the documentaries are free. Here's how you get in for free. You take your series ticket and you take it to the Hopkins Center box office and you hand it to them and they will punch holes. If you look there, you'll see that there are 3 sessions that are color-coded. Those are the 3 sessions for which there's a documentary beforehand. And they will punch a hole and they will give you a pass. And you need that pass to get into the movie. If you go to the box office anytime not within 1 hour of a film, you can get all 3 passes at one time. But if you come in within an hour of the beginning of a movie, you can only get 1 at that time. And the last comment is that because we had a late start, we are going to continue the Q&A for an extra 10 minutes. And we recognize that some of you may not be able to stay, and so feel free to get up and leave, but we will go 10 minutes more. John and Jim.
Thank you. By far, what I'm going to try to do, many questions hit on similar subjects connected to China. So in some cases, I'll paraphrase a question, but it reflects 4 or 5 of you. But by far, the biggest question you've all said or asked is North Korea and that Kim Jong-un. And I think really, to paraphrase the questions you asked, he seems absolutely determined to have a capability. Even on July 4, he wanted to show us that he had that intercontinental ballistic missile. What can China do effectively to rein him in? Is there anything we can do other than the devastation scenario? In other words, what's the options for North Korea?
Well, it's a great question. It's one of the most difficult policy problems out there. I started dealing with this problem early in my time during the Clinton administration, which was really, it was in '93 that for the first time that it became clear that North Korea was trying to develop a nuclear weapon. They had a nominally civilian nuclear program that was under safeguards from the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they started refusing to let the inspectors see their facilities, which led people to be suspicious, and ultimately they threw the inspectors out. In 1994, we negotiated what was called the Agreed Framework with North Korea, in which they agreed to give up their plutonium reprocessing program, which they were going to use to build their bomb, in return for having civilian nuclear reactors. That agreement fell apart for a variety of reasons, and historians and diplomats are debating to this day as to whose fault it was or why. My own view is that despite the agreement, that, as the questions suggest, that there really was a determination to build a nuclear weapon first and negotiate later, that they felt the need to have this at a minimum to increase their negotiating leverage, if not simply just to have it as a way of dealing both with what they perceived the external threat from the United States and South Korea, but also as a way of mobilizing the North Korean people to support what was otherwise an extraordinarily repressive, horrific regime. So the question then becomes, if in fact, as I believe, they were determined to have this capability, are there any circumstances in which they would give it up? And what should we be prepared to do? And then in connection with our topic, what should be our expectations vis-a-vis China? I think the short answer is that they aren't going to give it up in the near term, but it is also conceivable that they could do some things that lessen the escalation of the crisis, that would preserve the ambiguity about whether they have a robust nuclear program, with some sense over the long term that they might be committed as issues change in the region to get rid of it. And that having a long-term perspective with some short-term measures, like a freeze on their testing of nuclear weapons and freeze on testing their missiles, might be possible. The big question is this China's responsibility? And this has really been the great debate. We've certainly seen from President Trump an extreme version of that view, which is that it's up to China to solve this. If they do, we're going to be China's friends. If they don't, we're going to punish them in various ways, on trade, on Taiwan, or whatever. And we also saw, just the last 2 days, the Chinese Foreign Ministry pushing back on what they call the China responsibility thesis. This story, of course, is complicated, which is that China has a lot of influence. It certainly is an economic lifeline to the North Korean regime. But it is very important to recognize that there's no love lost between the North Koreans and the Chinese. And as little as the North Koreans trust and like us, they have a similar fear about China, both for historic reasons. China had a hegemonic role. North Korea was was something of a vassal state for important parts of Korean history. But more important, the whole theory of the regime is to have autonomy from everybody. And so the more the argument is made that China can pull the strings, the more resistant North Korea is to accommodating China. So the Chinese view of this is, one, we have some leverage, but it's not infinite. And second, the more coercive we are, the less likely North Korea is going to be to respond to us, because they will see this as another great power trying to intimidate them, and they will eat grass before they will give in to the Chinese. So can the Chinese do more? Yes, the Chinese can do more. They can make life more uncomfortable for the regime and create a better context for trying to find a negotiation which allows the North Koreans to continue to claim they have a nuclear capability, and for the rest of us to claim that we are working towards getting rid of it. But we should also, I think, be cautious about simply thinking that if they just flipped a switch in Beijing, that this problem would go away. It is not that simple. There is some truth to the Chinese argument that too much Chinese pressure could potentially be counterproductive. At the same time, it's also, one shouldn't excuse the Chinese too much. They don't want North Korea to have a nuclear weapon. There's no doubt about that. But they also don't mind having a North Korea there. It's a buffer between China and U.S. forces in South Korea. It's a constraint on our activities there. And they certainly don't want to see a collapse in North Korea that would lead either to chaos or hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of North Koreans fleeing into northeast China.
Thank you. The next several questions had to do with two personalities, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. Xi Jinping is a very tough, blunt person. His dad fought in the Mao's army, and he said, never again will we be humiliated. And he's appealing to his base, which is important. And Trump, of course, is saying, in a self-styled way, in a macho way, I'm going to put down all these threats and so forth. So with those two people, those two personalities, it's no longer a Barack Obama who is more nuanced, or Hu Jintao who's more of a technocrat. It really is from the very top, do we have the element of confrontation much more probable than it used to be? And the corollary question several of you asked is, does Trump surround himself with people in the State Department who can make sure he understands the implications of what he's considering?
So if we'd had this conversation a year ago, I would always begin with, we understand a lot more about what's going on in our policy process than we do in the Chinese process. And so while I'll give you some views about what's going on in the U.S. policy, I'll be cautious about the Chinese side. The first time I feel the exact opposite. I have a better sense of what's going on in China than I do here in the United States. I think your characterization of Xi Jinping is an excellent one. I think that he is a very strong and determined leader, has a very clear sense of the path forward for China. He's a strong nationalist. He does come out of this tradition, my quote, reference to it, of Mao's China that stood up. He is very determined that China will not be intimidated, will not be coerced, will be able to set its own destiny. And he is much more an individual leader than his predecessors. After Deng Xiaoping stepped down, the Chinese embraced this idea of collective leadership and not having one person in cult of personality, and that was largely true with Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, but Xi is very much the guy in charge. There's still elements of collective leadership. He can't get his way completely, but it's much more a strong force, and he's been building the apparatus through the anti-corruption campaign and other things to strengthen his position. This party Congress that we will see in the fall will be very, very significant in terms of understanding just where China's going and the extent of Xi's leadership. Will this two-term limitation hold? Will the various things that have been used over the last 20 years to constrain the individual leadership be whittled away at? I think there's some evidence that they will, but we often get these party leadership congresses right. Having said that, he's a strong leader. There's a strong national sentiment in China, but he's also very conscious of China's own challenges, economic challenges, its demographic challenges. Somebody asked me in the break, well, China's got 4 times the population. Aren't they destined to rule the world? The problem is that China has a huge demographic problem. It will be the first country that may grow old before it gets rich because of the one-child policy and the fact that the demographics are not very favorable for China. There's no immigration, birth rates are low, and so they may have a very large older population that's being supported by a smaller, younger population. There are environmental issues, there are public health issues, there are enormous challenges. And I think he is very conscious of that. And so those are constraints on how confrontational he wants to be, how much of a crisis he wants to have with the outside world. And you see this in his engagement with President Trump at Mar-a-Lago and elsewhere, and this continued willingness to try to find a way forward, and frankly not rising to the bait of a number of the provocations that Trump put out. For example, during the transition when Trump suggested he might revisit the one China policy, the Chinese were very laid back about this. They said, we're going to work on him, we're going to engage with him. So I think there's a strong sense of China now charting its own course, being less dependent, more willing to confront the United States, but also not seeking a crisis. On the U.S. side, I honestly don't know. I mean, it's very difficult for me to judge how much the president's strategy is one of keeping people off balance, uncertainty as a kind of a tactical leveraging move, as opposed to a deep strategy. And none of us, I think, have a sense of how the influence of the members of his cabinet work. I mean, his cabinet members are largely sensible. I don't agree with all of their policies, but they are mainstream national security oriented individuals. But I don't think any of us has a real good sense of how the policy process works. It doesn't seem to be the kind of orderly, regular process that really has been in place for 30 or 40 years in the national security decision-making process and the National Security Council. And so it remains to be seen, I think, how this actually plays out in practice.
Thank you. This is a question having to do with environmental pollution in China, air and water and so forth, and the development of clean energy. It seems that China has a very robust clean energy manufacturing sector, and they don't worry about some of these things being out in the oceans or on hilltops, because they just do the wind turbines when they need them. We, however, drop out of the Paris Accord. Are we in the process of ceding global energy leadership to China?
Well, it's a complicated story. I mean, I think that on the one hand, the old-fashioned environmental challenges, the kind that we really began to deal with in the 1960s and 1970s, air pollution, water pollution, and the like, are extraordinarily serious challenges for China. The magnitude of the difficulties are just extraordinary. It's you've seen the pictures of the air over Beijing and Shanghai. I mean, that's something we've never experienced, that kind of localized, health-oriented pollution at the scale that China is experiencing, the poisoned water. It's really quite serious. And while there are a number of measures in place, they're still not anywhere near what's needed to deal with those kinds of problems. And the water problem in particular is extraordinary. I mean, China, the north, has no water. And there have been extraordinary attempts to develop these technological fixes with canals and dams and the like, but China just has no water. And this is a huge impact on both economic growth, public health, and social stability, which they have not really fully come to grips with yet. We see some recognition of this in the fact that while for many years they resisted being part of these climate negotiations, arguing that the West had benefited from all this carbon-driven economies to become rich, and that China was entitled to catch up and they shouldn't have to pay the price of our past sins. Now they recognize that even for their own sake, they need to be part of this. But it's also true that they have some good technologies and things of the sort. But a lot of what's driving this is less about government policies and more about the private sector. And so even if the U.S. government is not in the game in the Paris Climate Agreement, doesn't mean that U.S. industry, U.S. technology, U.S. innovation isn't going to play a role. And I think you're going to see the states and the private sector and localities also playing a role. So I don't think we're out of the game. I think the consequence of the decision to pull out of the treaty is less in that area than more in terms of our global leadership, in the sense of the United States ceding a sense of global responsibility. I think you hear a lot, and we see it just even today. There's another op-ed from Gary Cohn and General McMaster, basically, making this argument for the America First foreign policy, which sounds to the rest of the world like we're going to take care of ourselves and the heck with the rest of you. And that's problematic in terms of not just our soft power, but our ability to get what we want. Because if other countries think we're only in it for ourselves, their willingness to cooperate with us may be more difficult.
Thank you. Two questions came from our friends at the University of Vermont, Osher, and I'll combine them with this. And it has to do with the world role of China. China never got embroiled in Afghanistan. You didn't see them in Iraq. In the Middle East, you don't see them there. They don't feel like they're the world's policemen like we are. On the other hand, they're all over the world for resources, and they're getting their way dealing with despotic regimes in so many African countries and so forth. So one question had to do with why they're doing this. Are they in the Middle East? Do they have no concern about the Islamic movement? And secondly, are they getting their cake and eating it too by not getting involved in these other issues?
Well, those are great questions. And I think it's really a work in progress to try to understand this conception. And I don't think there's a fully evolved sense in China about this. It goes to my broader question about intentions. I think, let's not forget there was, although it was not a huge role, that during the early years of the Cold War, the Chinese were involved some. They supported communist revolutions in a number of different countries around the world. And I mean, it was not a lot, they didn't have a lot of resources to put on it, but they were certainly supportive of movements, great, wonderful ties between Albania and China during the Cold War. Albania was more aligned with China than with the Soviet Union. And so and in Africa as well. So there was a period during the revolutionary period where China sort of saw itself as part of this global vanguard. And then especially after the death of Mao and the ascension of Deng Xiaoping, they basically pulled back and focused on domestic economic growth and development. And arguably, you could say, and I think it's implicit in the question, that they free rode on what other people were doing. I mean, if the United States was prepared to keep the global commons open and keep the maritime trade open and deal with piracy and all these other issues, that was great for China that could export without having to pay the price. It's clear that China sees itself having a bigger role. Whether it is one that can just focus on the kind of the mercenary mercantile dimension and leave these other problems to others is less clear. I mentioned the base in Djibouti, the new Chinese base in Djibouti. You can see this as part of their basically recognizing that they have to be more active and engaged. So they are participating in the anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. They have played a more constructive role in recent years in Sudan and trying to deal with the war in Sudan. And so I think we're at an inflection point for China as it's trying to figure out what it's going to do. The more it engages, even if it starts out only on the economic level, the more likely it's going to get involved. During the Libya crisis, for example, there were a lot of Chinese working in Libya and the Libyan energy industry. And when the fighting began and Gaddafi began to threaten his own people, the Chinese were faced with a problem that they had lots of their own citizens in harm's way and no way to get them out. And they, kind of had to turn to the U.S. and Europeans to help evacuate the Chinese citizens. But they also determined after that they had to develop the capability to do that, in the future, to do these, what we call NEOs, these evacuations, these emergency operations. That means developing a military capability. It's not a war-fighting capability, but it's a military capability. And so in the old days, we used to say that, the flag followed trade. Here you have a situation where the more they have economic interests abroad, the more they're going to care about security in the Middle East, in Africa. So it may be that whether they want to or not, they will have to play a bigger role. And then the question becomes, is it a constructive role, and when they're working together with others, or is it a kind of zero-sum?
Thank you. There were a number of questions, of course, for you to expand more on those islands in the South China Sea. We're trying not to take sides regarding sovereignty, as I understand it. And the question is, though, what if a military event occurs between U.S. and China, but provoked by a third party that's where we have a treaty, like the Philippines or some other country, and our wars, the Archduke and other examples of wars, have been started often by a third party, and then the treaties kicked in and the war began. Is that a real threat here?
Well, I think the hard problem here is that in the kinds of scenarios that one can imagine, it will probably be ambiguous as to who provoked it. That is, there will be different views about where the provocation came from. And it's kind of like, where do you start in the provocation chain, right? I mean, so for example, one of the most contentious areas is the so-called Scarborough Shoal. The Scarborough Shoal is a reef that is about 350 kilometers from China and about 150 kilometers from the Philippines. It is part of the so-called 9-dash line, this sort of expansive claim that China has made to the islands and perhaps the waters of the South China Sea. But it is also within the exclusive economic zone under the Law of the Sea Treaty of the Philippines. Both sides claim it, right? And over the last decade, there have been a variety of skirmishes that have taken place there, each of whom saying that the other caused it. The Philippines, saying that the Chinese have excluded their fishermen, the Chinese saying it's ours, and they're trying to force their fishermen in. Where you start and who's it's in the eye of the beholder will define who the provocation is. And there aren't clear rules about what this is. We've had an important decision by the Arbitration Commission that looked at this question at the request of the Philippines that have set down some guidelines, but even there will be elements of ambiguity. So the likelihood is if we have a crisis, it will come, where each side blames the other for provoking it. And the question will then be, how do we respond to this? For the United States, it will be very important that we make clear that we take our treaty obligations seriously. If there becomes any doubt about this, in my view, it will create a great deal of uncertainty in the region. At the same time, the trick is to provide that resolve around the treaty commitments without escalating the crisis more than is necessary. So you have to find ways in which you stand by your commitments, but you also don't, make this a game of chicken to see, who's going to back down, who's going to save face. It is very complicated because each time there's an agreement. So on the Scarborough Shoal, there was a crisis in 2012 in which the Chinese there were some Philippine Marines on the shoal. The Chinese were trying to starve them out, in effect. And the United States helped broker agreement for both sides to step back, right? Filipinos did, the Chinese didn't, right? So now the Chinese actually occupy it, but we have the UN claiming that this is actually within the Philippines' EEZ. If the Philippines now try to retake it, is that a provocation, or is that exerting their rights under the UN agreement? That's where the problems are going to be. And here, I think the question is trying to get everybody to recognize that there will be disputes about whose territory it is, whose sovereignty, and we aren't going to resolve those. But can we develop some rules of the road, some modus vivendi in which each side agree not to use force, not to try to change the status quo, that prevent these ambiguous but potentially dangerous situations from arising?
Another question is, China and the United States have very different political systems. It's hard for maybe each to understand totally the other. Does this create a more dangerous atmosphere for containing confrontations and understanding intentions?
I don't think it's so much a question that we don't understand each other's system. It's that we disagree with each other's system. And so we are not willing to simply say, well, that's their system and we have to take it as we find it. And it's a long history of the United States believing that these things do matter, right? And so the idea that we would simply say, well, that's their system, we don't like it, but we have to live with it, is very difficult for the United States. We saw this, I talked about Liu Xiaobo, many of you saw at the break, he died in the last few hours. It is inevitable. I mean, even a realist like Henry Kissinger says repeatedly in his own writings that it's inconceivable that American foreign policy will not include an element of values in it. So it's not, some of it is misunderstanding, but some of it is simply we are not willing to accept some of the things that they claim the right to do. And they, in turn, don't accept our views about intervention, about human rights, about democracy. So these are just inherent tensions there that are less from misunderstandings and more from just, frankly, a disagreement about what is legitimate and what's not legitimate.
For a long time in the early part of the transformation, China provided low-cost manufacturing, which was, of course, appreciated by many companies who moved jobs there. Now they're facing their own competition, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and they're trying to go up the chain technologically. Are they successful, or do they face the problem of a lot of workers, cheaper, that are going to be out of work?
Well, they're clearly making the transition. Labor costs now in China are dramatically higher than they were 20 years ago, and they are not competitive with the really low-cost manufacturers. They don't have any choice about moving up the value chain. The question is more whether they can do that without changing their social and political policies that facilitate innovation, independence, and the like. You know, the question is whether there's a tension between these strategies of control, the Great Firewall, the very heavy hand that's now being used in universities to affect the dissent and diversity of views, and still have the kind of creative ability to make those changes. And I think that the jury's out on that. Clearly the leadership feels it can do this and still maintain the social and political control. Many people debate that proposition about whether you can get the kind of innovation, entrepreneurial society and still have these kinds of controls. But they will have to do it. I mean, the days of China as being able to succeed as a low-cost exporting economy are over, both because of their labor costs and because they need to be able to generate much more domestic demand to move up for their own standard of living.
The U.S. and China recently agreed not to do any government-led cyber attacks on each other. Is this really verifiable, enforceable, and sustainable?
They didn't agree to do that. They did not agree to do that. I mean, what they have agreed is to try to work together on cyber economic espionage. So that what they in principle have agreed is that that stealing trade secrets, patents, privileged economic information should be illegitimate. Neither side should do it, either as governments or individuals, and that they would work together to deal with cyber economic crimes. There's a broad international consensus that should be illegal internationally. There's a thing called the Budapest Convention, which most developed countries have signed on to, that accept as an international norm that is illegitimate to use hacking to get economic advantage. And there's some chance that the Chinese, for the reasons we were just talking about, as they move up the value chain, will see this in their interest, that the short-term value they get from stealing from American manufacturers will be outweighed over time by the fact that people start stealing from them. The jury is mixed on that. Some people would say there's some evidence since that agreement 2 years ago with President Obama and President Xi that there's been some improvement on the economic front. I don't have firsthand knowledge. I read about it. And some of the experts, non-government experts, have said the Chinese activity seems to have diminished. We'll see. But the one thing they don't agree on is on the government-to-government side. I mean, all of you who Remember Casablanca, I'm shocked, 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 right? Governments are going to use these tools against each other because they can't not. And I don't think anybody has any expectations that as a matter of state policy, when it comes to national security, that will be considered to be fair game on both sides. And I don't think there's been any serious attempt. I mean, there's been some talk about sensitizing everybody to recognizing that the use of these cyber tools could be very dangerous in a conflict, but I don't think we're anywhere close to having any kinds of agreements on state-to-state use of cyber.
Okay. China has led the development of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And when they started that, America protested. We pleaded with Britain and Germany and Japan not to join it, which probably was a little bit of a feeling of suppression, but anyway, not to join it. Yet they all joined it. And at the same time, a while later, America withdraws from the Asia-Pacific Trade Pact. The combination of these two events, are we beginning to cede economic leadership, or more of it, to China than they've ever had before?
Well, I think both are unfortunate. They were both unfortunate decisions. I think that there's been a long history of the United States wanting to privilege the economic institutions that we created just up the road here in Bretton Woods as the foundational organizations for the international order. It was attractive to us for two reasons. One, because we had the dominant voice, and two, because it embodied our views about liberal international economic policies. And so keeping the preeminence of the World Bank, of the IMF, and the WTO were very high priorities for the United States for a long time. And at various times, even back in the 1970s and 1980s, as Japan was coming up and beginning to talk about Japan establishing some Asia-only organizations, we resisted that. We had Prime Minister Mahathir in Malaysia talking about an East Asia economic structure that excluded the United States. And we've always resisted. We've always said, no, ours is great, it's perfect, nobody should toy with it. If you want to do stuff, we've got the perfect answer. There are two ways to look at the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Bank. One is an attempt by China to basically put aside the US-dominated institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to build some in which China is the dominant voice as a rival. And the other is to say, look, the World Bank and the IMF are great, but they don't have nearly enough resources to deal with these problems, and the AIIB is a supplement to these other initiatives, and we can have both. The United States chose to see the AIIB in its most unfriendly light, which is a challenge to the Western order that was going to not have liberal principles, it wasn't going to have transparency, it wasn't going to have the kind of rules about no tied aid and that sort of thing, and try to block it rather than taking the opposite approach to say, well, instead of no, a yes but, which is to say, well, we might be prepared to join it, but here are the conditions: transparency, lots of different voices, multilateral, not dominated just by China. We never tested the proposition about whether this could be more benign rather than dangerous. And so we lost an opportunity, and frankly, we showed our own weakness, because other than Japan, we were not able to persuade anybody to follow our lead. So we got the worst of all worlds, which is we have an AIIB, we look weak in the face of our allies who thumbed their nose at us, and now we're trying to figure out how to step back. Coupling that with the decision not to move forward with the TPP does raise a question about whether we can engage in a way with the give and take that you have to have on the international stage. And this comes back to Trump and the America First policy, which is that if we think we can just insist it's going to be our way, and we get the deal we want, or we're going to walk away from it, increasingly people are going to say, well, if those are the only two choices, we're walking away from you. And I think that's very, very dangerous and risky. I mean, there's inevitably compromise. There are going to be deals in which we have to make some concessions, they make concessions. There are lots of problems with the TPP. I don't want to pretend that it was a perfect agreement. If I'd been king and negotiated, there would have been features that we should have done differently. And I understand that a lot of people feel it didn't really address the concerns of American workers and people who've suffered from trade. But this was a case where the focus should be mend it, don't end it. And by walking away, we have really, I think, abandoned a lot of important leadership and leverage that we need.
Also connected with trade, recently there was a slight agreement, a bilateral, where China would import U.S. beef and let U.S. financial institutions into the country. But the U.S. is rattling the sword about possibly placing duties on Chinese steel or imported steel. China being a huge producer, in fact, they built the Oakland Bay Bridge, I think, all with Chinese steel. How volatile would that be to China if the U.S. were to put heavy duties on the importation of their steel from one of their major industries?
Well, the steel issue is bigger than just U.S. China, and you saw this during the president's trip to Europe, because it will also have really big implications for Europe. I mean, because the way they would have to do it would not just affect imports from China. It's a complicated story in steel. There's no doubt that China and others have dumped steel. I mean, they have an overcapacity. They way overinvested in what they needed, and they've come to realize that they had built a bubble that they couldn't support, and the typical response is to dump steel. So there's a legitimate problem here. I don't want to suggest that somehow there's nothing to the U.S. complaint. The International Trade Commission has found, this, and I think there's some evidence behind it. The problem is, how do you work these things through? There are mechanisms that kind of depoliticize these things, and rather than turning them into kind of a political contest, we need to find ways to use WTO mechanisms and related mechanisms to try to work these things out. I mean, there are ways of doing this that make it less sort of like a political attack and more based on the rule of law and principle. I think that would both vindicate our legitimate interest in fair trade without necessarily roiling the whole question. And especially now on trade, it's unclear, and I touched on this in my talk, whether we're doing this because of the unfair trade practices or whether we're going to punish them on steel because they're not helping us in North Korea. It's that linkage which I think is very dangerous. If we start saying, well, we'll give you a buy on steel if you help us in North Korea, but if you don't, then we're going to punish you on steel, all of a sudden, by linking everything to everything, you're going to end up completely unwinding the whole relationship.
Sovereignty appears to be a huge, huge issue to China. After the century of humiliation, when the invading and occupying powers took away in the treaties against this poor peasant country, China, Macau, Hong Kong, Taiwan, as kind of just a land grab. Now they've got back Hong Kong and Macau. Taiwan sits out there. Obviously, we have just signed or sent in a treaty or whatever, more weapons for Taiwan. Is China simply going to be patient and patient and patient forever? Or there's so many ties between Taiwan and China. What do you see happening in the future to this? Will it stay independent, still part of China, or what will happen?
Well, I think you have to begin with the reality of life on the island of Formosa, which is there's almost nobody in Taiwan who wants to be part of the PRC. And so that's a really critical reality here, which is that even if we were to say, fine, we're not going to sell arms, the Chinese attempt to re-control Taiwan, as we are seeing in a much more favorable situation to China vis-a-vis Hong Kong, would be a catastrophe. I mean, the people of Taiwan would not put up with it, and while it's theoretically possible that China could militarily either coerce or subjugate them, there'd be a prolonged civil war that would be awful for everybody. So I think that ultimately the Chinese recognize that whatever the international legal situation, that they have to deal with the fundamental realities there. Now, they would argue that if the people of Taiwan knew they were abandoned by the United States and the rest of the people, they would recognize they have no choice but to accept union with China and they'd get used to it. I don't buy it for a second. I think I've spent a lot of time in Taiwan. I think it's a fiercely independent country which is very proud of its democratic achievements. So I think that there is no Chinese leader will ever, certainly never acknowledge the right of Taiwan to go its own way, or even sort of accept the fact that we can put this off forever. It is a matter of Chinese policy that this has to be accomplished and it can't be put off forever. At the same time, there's not a lot of evidence that China is trying to, force the issue, right? And that as a practical matter, the modus vivendi that's been established for since 1978, the Carter decision to recognize PRC, has more or less worked, which is that we don't recognize Taiwan independence, we don't support it, but we also oppose any attempt to coerce the Taiwanese people, and will continue to provide enough support to Taiwan for them to feel confident to resist Chinese coercion. And, a crisis could come, but we've just had a very dramatic development, which is the people of Taiwan have elected Tsai Ing-wen, the head of the DPP, Green Party, which has strong supporters of independence within its ranks. And while there's been tensions, it hasn't created a crisis. So you should never say never in this business. We'll wake up tomorrow, there'll be a big Taiwan crisis. But of the big challenges right now, I think Taiwan is less likely, simply because I think nobody is that has enough reason to try to force a change in the modus vivendi that exists.
What do you think of China doing the Silk Road project, and what is that good or bad for America, and how could you comment on that project?
Well, again, this is one of those Rashomon phenomena, which is that in some ways, economic development in Central Asia would help deal with problems of terrorism, of drugs, all the problems that are exported from Central Asia to the rest of the world. And so we should want to see economic development there. It's probably good from our perspective for there to be a balance to Russia, which is the other dominant force in the region. And so we don't want to see a Russian dominance in the region as well. And by opening up new trade routes and increasing the prosperity of these countries, potentially everybody can benefit, right? So there's a win-win side to this, but as with everything with China these days, it's also possible to discern dark intentions to create hegemony over the region and see this as a way of extending Chinese influence to the region, of China getting energy independence by having land access to the Caspian Sea and the energy resources of Central Asia, so that they don't have to depend on oil that goes through shipping lanes, which could be interdicted by the United States, and as a way of projecting power. So China is building ports in Gwadar and Pakistan, and was building a port in Sri Lanka. So if you're inclined to see this as Michael Pillsbury's 100-year strategy, you can see dark things there. And this is where, there's no answer to this, because I think the Chinese convince themselves this is all virtuous, but I also think they see the collateral strategic benefits. And so we need to find a way to engage and say, okay, well, we're not against this. We see the benefits to you, to the people of the region, to us. But here are the things that concern us, and how can you reassure us that your goals here are win-win, cooperative, and not at the expense of others? It's not just us, by the way. The Indians, for example, are deeply concerned about what the Chinese, is this a Chinese encirclement of India?
Yeah. A lot of people mentioned about the local diplomacy going on locally in China. We had John Huntsman, of course, for a while, which we are well aware of. We had an interim diplomat, Ambassador David Rank, who, when we refused to sign the Paris Accord, or we withdrew, resigned. And now we have Terry Branstad, the governor of Iowa. Is he up to this task? Or is he backed by enough people that we have confidence that the ambassadorial influence at the local level is strong?
The role of ambassadors today is very different than it was 40, 50, 100 years ago. The nature of both modern communications and the intensity of the global interaction, high-level diplomacy, right? I mean, if there's a big issue, President Trump picks up the call and talks to Xi Jinping. He doesn't send a message to the ambassador who then goes in to see Xi Jinping. So, for better or for worse, I've dealt with a lot of ambassadors who felt like their roles had been diminished, they hadn't been taken advantage of enough. But I think ambassadors today play a different kind of role. One, they are advocates for American interests in the country on the day-to-day side, for American business, for American students, for American visitors, which is very important, you know, and it's the bread and butter. Second, they're a window onto the society. They're living there. They get to know people, and they can give some texture to what's going on, both at the government level but also at the societal level. And that's invaluable because you can sit in Washington all you want, but you're not really going to have a feel for the way you can if you're having dinner and tea and talking and playing tennis and going for walks with people in a country that you've been sent to. So I think that kind of, you know, on the ground reality is quite important. And I don't think there's any one CV that fits that role. You know, John Huntsman was an unusual figure, but he grew up in China. He was from missionary families, right? And so, yes, he was a Republican politician and from an energy family, but he also had his own personal experience and spoke Mandarin, so he was a great asset. Governor Branstad has had a lot of dealings with China. So I don't think there's a single answer for both who makes for a good ambassador and precisely how best to use that role, simply to understand that it is just different today than it was back when, you know, in the 19th century, where it took 2 weeks for the instructions to get from the president to the country. The ambassador had to do this himself.
This is another question from the people in Vermont, University of Vermont, and it's really speculating in the future, but we'll ask you the question. Since one result of America's world leadership the last 75 years or so has been a perpetual state of wars, Korean War, Vietnam War, Iraq, Afghanistan, Middle East, is there any chance that China's rise may lead to a more peaceful world?
That's such a big question. I mean, I think that, part of the problem is that there are very, very different conceptions about global order. You know, I'm an academic now. There are a lot of academic theorists who spend a lot of time on this. There's a very strong sentiment, especially in academia, that actually, as the premise of the question, that actually the problem is all this U.S. interventionism, and that if people would just have a more modest view about their international engagement, not try to interfere in internal affairs of other countries, let everybody decide for themselves, and then and limit the engagement to responding to aggression when one country intervenes in another, that the world would be more peaceful. And it's all this U.S. activism that's caused the problem. I don't buy it. I think that the world is too interconnected. What happens in one country affects us too much, and the notion that we can sort of simply have our hands off, do balance of power, and protect our own shores, I think misunderstands phenomena like ISIS, like global public health issues, like terrorism, like nonproliferation, and that it's just not clear that a Chinese order, especially one that's based on non-intervention, individual respect for sovereignty, and a kind of a value-free international order, would be more stable. So I'm quite skeptical, though there are, as I say, many in the world, especially of academic international theory, who would be sympathetic to that argument.
Another question is, can we really trust China to fulfill its commitments vis-a-vis, it said it really isn't militarizing the South China Sea Islands, but on the other hand, up in negotiations with North Korea, but apparently trade is up 10% even in the last 6 months between China and North Korea. And it says it will promote fair trade, but it fails to protect U.S. intellectual property. So the question really, I guess the intent of it is can we trust them when it comes to doing what they agree to do?
Well, I don't put a lot of focus or faith in trust as an element of conducting international relations. I don't agree with President Reagan on a lot of things, but the trust but verify, to my mind, is an important principle of diplomacy. Countries do what they're going to do based on their calculation of their national interest. And so what we have to do is we have to try to shape their national interests so that they want to do what we want them to do. And in many cases, that's not that hard because our interests are not misaligned. On North Korea, there's no question in my mind that China wants a non-nuclear North Korea. It is not in China's interest. There's anybody in China who thinks this is a good thing. So we have a basic common shared view, and so then the question is then how do we develop a joint strategy to achieve that? Similarly, on the South China Sea, China needs the shipping lanes to remain open. They need there not to be an out-and-out maritime war in the South China Sea because, first of all, we would eventually prevail, I believe, but in any event, in the course of it, the impact of the Chinese economy of a significant military engagement in the South China Sea that basically would close off shipping. I mean, it doesn't take warships. Even the threat of war would cause every insurer to cancel insurance against any ship going through the South China Sea, and China may be moving away from manufacturing exports, but it still does a lot of it. So they have an interest in not doing that. And so we have to make clear that, as we work through these things, we need to shape their interest. And if they do things, especially when they agree to do things and they don't do them, that there are costs associated with it. There are ways to help incentivize positively and negative the behavior, and not to do it just because we trust them, but we do it because we structure it in a way that it's in their interest to do what we have jointly agreed that we should do.
You mentioned in your talk about China increasing its military spending, still far below the U.S., but increasing it. And indeed, they seem to have stealth technology, stealth airplanes, stealth submarines, and stealth drones that look remarkably similar to the ones that we have in certain cases. But also, they're doing more missile development. Could you put their missile development in the context of what our missile development is, or just give a frame of how extensive that is?
China's clearly modernizing across the board. Some of it is stolen technology. A lot of it's Russian technology, frankly. It's not ours. If you want to look at what they're copying, it tends to be more Russian than ours. On missiles, the focus, China, as I mentioned briefly in the talk, actually has not, surprisingly in some levels, has not focused on intercontinental ballistic missiles or developing its nuclear capability and missile capability against the United States. They have missiles that could hit the United States. They're pretty confident they'll get through, and it's not a big priority for them. What they are focused is on short and medium range missiles, and the reason is this part of the strategy to make it harder for the United States and our allies to operate in the Western Pacific. So what they want is they want the ability not to hit Washington or Los Angeles or even Hawaii, but to hit Okinawa and Guam so that we don't have a sanctuary to conduct military operations against them. And so they're building surface-to-surface missiles that have those kinds of ranges. They're building surface-to-ship missiles so that our carriers can't operate in the Western Pacific. They're developing capabilities against our aircraft. That's their main goal. It's much more tactical than strategic goal. And the idea is basically, up till recently, we could operate with impunity all through the Western Pacific and basically go where we wanted to go, including close to China, and be able to project force into China from these forward bases. They want to deny us that. In the lingo of my world of strategists, they want to push us back, first past the first island chain, which is Taiwan, then past the second island chain, which is Guam, ultimately back to the fourth island chain, so we're back to Hawaii. Then they're more secure. That's their goal. And much of their technological development, especially the missiles, is focused on that.
I want to thank Jim Steinberg for an absolutely stimulating day.
Thank you. Great question. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, very much. I love the Q&A.